My name is Ivy Dumont. I was born Ivy Leona Turnquest in a little settlement on Long Island called Roses. As I recall Roses, it is one of the smallest, I guess, settlements on Long Island, and it's near the southern end. So people talked about us as coming from South End, as opposed to people below the capital, Clarence Down, coming from North End. So if you were from South End, you talked with a twang like my mother did. She was from Roses, Long Island, but my dad was from Deadman's Key, which is in the middle part of the island. And they thought that they were the special people because they were the biggest settlement on the island. Now, my mother comes from a long line of Roses people by the name of Darville. Some of you might hear people talking about D'Arville. Well, that's the same family. And my grandfather was the catechist at the Anglican Church. So my mother grew up in the church, as did her sisters and brothers. My father went to Roses from Deadman's Key as a school teacher. In those days, there was something called the Grant-in-Aid School. And so that meant that the government paid the teacher some money, and the community was responsible for providing him with whatever they could to assist him, for example, farm products, fish, and so forth. Now, I left Roses, Long Island when I was 8 years old because my father transferred to the school in Deadman's Key, which was to become our permanent home. And I was able to go to the school in Buckley's, which is now called NGM Major High School. When I went to the school, it was an all-age school, which meant that children went there from the age of 6 until they were 14, which was the school-leaving age. No matter how smart you were or how dull you were, at the age of 14, boys and girls had to leave school. So many girls got married very early, and many boys went with their fathers to sea, either to work on the boats or to fish. And that was what I grew up in as a young person. Now, my school was considered even then a good school. People who hear about NGM Major will know that he was considered, still is considered, one of the lead family island head teachers in the Bahamas. And it must be so because a school is named for him, and it is now a senior high school. However, when I went to school, there was something called the gallery, which was like a staircase that the youngest children sat on. And then when they got old enough, maybe 7 or 8, they were able to sit in 6-foot desks and were taught by older students who were called monitors. Now, I wasn't very, very smart, but I was smart enough that when I got to be 11, Mr. Major made me a monitor. Or I guess you could call it a monitress if you want to separate male and female. And I got 4 shillings a month for being a monitor. Now that would probably be about 25 cents in today's money, or maybe a little bit more. And having gone from being on a regular class to being a monitress, Mr. Major insisted that we who were in that category stayed behind after school so he could ensure that we got our education while we were helping the smaller children to get their education. At that time, he decided that his students were going to take what was called the Common Entrance Exam. Now, Common Entrance was set by the Department of Education in Nassau, and students at age 11 could write that exam, and if they passed, they would come to high school in Nassau because there was only one government high school in the Bahamas. there was another high school, but that was owned by a church. So Government High was called the Government High School. And only one person from our school had taken the exam prior to myself, and she passed the exam. So you can imagine the pressure that was on me to pass too, which I did. And so when I was 12 years old, I came to school in Nassau. Now, up to that point, I lived with my brothers and sisters, some of whom were very small because I'm the eldest child. And some of my brothers and sisters were born after I left and came to Nassau, so I didn't know them until they were pretty grown, except I went home for holidays. The summer holidays from Government High used to be 10 weeks. So I would go home at the beginning and come back at the end. But I had to go by sailboat. And going on the sailboat meant that I was sick on the boat for about a week or thereabouts. Sometimes it could be as long as 2 weeks to get from Nassau to Long Island. And we had to make stops along the way, the Exuma Keys, to let people off so they could stop and get a rest, maybe have a good meal. And only if the wind was favorable, we would be able to get home in a week. That sounds terrible now that I say it, but that's how terrible sick I was many of the times I was on the boats. So I told my dad the last time I went home on a boat that was the last time he was going to see me on Long Island until I was able to come on a plane. And sure enough, the next time I went 18 years later, I went on a plane. But in the days I'm talking about now, back in the 40s, there was no such thing as planes going to the Family Islands. Now back to my schooling. So what did I do at Buckley's? Well, we did what were called the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. And once we got those things settled in ourselves, we had to do music. Mr. Major was a music teacher by heart. He didn't play an organ or piano as far as I know, but he had something called a tuning fork that he would hit on a piece of metal, I suspect, and it gave a sound which told him how high he could pitch the tune or how low. And we would all be trained how to sing. I was never good at it, so I would be at the back while all the other children got to stand in the front rows. And then eventually, he was a very clever principal. He knew that I loved to sew. So he would find some little work for me to do in the sewing that I didn't have to be in the choir. And I was so, so happy. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't appreciate music. I just mean that I'm not the one to provide the music. The other thing he did that might be of interest is that he insisted on having a school garden. And the school garden was built between the schoolhouse itself and the teacher's residence, because the government provided a place for the teacher to live. And so the boys had to determine how this plot would be set out. They had to construct the walls around it as if it was an enclosure, probably 4 feet, 3-4 feet tall. And then we all had to find soil from wherever we could find it to put into that area to prepare the garden. Everybody had to take a turn at the garden to weed, to plant, to transplant, and eventually to eat the vegetables. Again, I was excused because I would turn my plants up the next day to see if they had any new roots. So they got me out of the garden pretty early. But when the vegetables were ready, Mr. Major insisted that everybody tasted everything. So his wife would boil the beets, and we all had to eat beets. we had to eat raw carrots. We had to eat raw tomatoes. And eventually, as a result of that, practically every home in the area, in Edmonds Key definitely, had a home garden. And so to this day, I think that goes on, but it was started at our school in Buckley's. Now, moving on to Government High School. I told you what I learned or was supposed to learn in Buckley's: reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, the basic stuff. Now, when we came to Government High School, I was one of 30 students in form. They weren't called grades, they were called forms. And we began at Form 3 because we were out of the junior high level. And we had to learn Latin, algebra, geometry, things I had never heard about. And the teachers were mostly British, so they spoke with a very strange accent. There were only 2 Bahamian teachers in Government High for the years that I was there. And you would know the names because one was called Mrs. Anatole Rogers, she was Miss Reeves, and the other one was called Cecil Bethel. And both of them eventually became head of Government High Schools, so we know that they were good at what they did. Now, when we got into these classes, what we had to study was strange to me, but in addition to that, we moved from place to place. I never knew that classes moved from room to room for the teachers to come in. And when the teacher came in her robe, black robe, we all had to stand and wait to be told to be seated. And when we were seated and we wanted to speak, we had to respectfully raise the hand. We had to do homework every night. There were 3 subjects and 4 subjects on the weekend. And on the morning, we go to school, we turn in our homework material. They had to be put in alphabetical order on the teacher's desk. I was this person in charge of the girls' group. And so I had to learn the alphabet for the girls really fast. And I remember the names still of my girl classmates, because we weren't called by our first names. We were called by our surnames. So we had Burroughs, Butler, Carey, Coakley, Hannah, Johnson, Ramming, Rookwood, Stiles, Turnquest, and Wright. And I remember them to this day. Most of them, I think about 2 or 3 of us are still alive, but we became friends and stayed friends throughout our lives. Now, the worst thing that could have happened, into Form 4, which was always considered the hardest form to be in Government High School, teachers then were beginning to push for those who were going to take the exams. Nowadays, we do our own local examinations. But when I went to high school, our exams were set by the University of Cambridge. It was called the Cambridge Junior Certificate or the Cambridge Senior Certificate. Later, we began to do the London certificates, London O-levels and the London A-levels. Well, I was supposed to be doing the Cambridge Junior, and that was the year that the Bahamas, certainly New Providence, was racked with typhoid fever. And we learned later that it's a waterborne disease. Now, you would wonder how then could you get typhoid if it wasn't an airborne disease? Well, we didn't have running water in our houses. I lived on the Fort Castle area with my grandmother when I came to Nassau. And so I had to take the pail and go down to the pump at the end of the road to get water. And if there were lots of people there ahead of me, well, they would get first and then I would go afterwards. But I don't think any of us washed our hands after we did our pail full or bottle full. So we just passed the germs on from one to the other. So I ended up in hospital with typhoid fever, as did another 2 or 3 of Government High students. One of them eventually died. And I remember the evening well because I had been unconscious for some while. And when I woke up, I said to my nurse, I dreamt that I saw a boat going out of the hospital gate down Shirley Street. And she looked at me and she said, no, not a boat. And later I learned that it was one of my classmates who had died in the night. And I remember that story still with some grief. Another one of our friends from our class got better, as did I. But in those days, I had very long hair. I used to have big braids. And when I came out of the hospital, I had no hair at all. But we used to do a parade on Bay Street for the 24th of May, which was Empire Day. And our principal said everybody had to go. So as long as you were able to walk and put on your uniform, you had to be in the parade. So there I was, quite bald. And I was so angry with him. But fortunately, in those days, we didn't take a lot of photographs either, so there's no evidence of that as far as I'm aware. Well, that set me back a year. So I had to repeat Form 4. But meantime, I should mention that my godmother, bless her heart, stayed in Nassau, although she was from Long Island too, to be with me until I was able to leave the hospital because my grandmother couldn't stay. And when I was able, she took me on in a horse and carriage down to the boat, which was tied up at what we call the Market Dock, and sailed off to Long Island. And she told me afterwards that when she got me home, how my mother and father, as she put it, frapped me in their arms. I always think of that fondly. But I had to be out of school, and I came back, and the next year I took the Cambridge Junior, was successful, then stayed the next year and did the Cambridge Senior. And it might be interesting to know who were people in my class at Government High School, come to think of it. Everybody would know the name Lyndon Pinley. Everybody would know the name Cecil Wallace Whitfield. A lot of people would know Dr. Earl Farrington. Many people would know the name Patricia Fountain. She became Mrs. Isaacs. These were Government High School students. And many of my classmates became very prominent in the affairs of development in the country. So whilst I probably could have called them still Wallace Whitfield, well, he was Wallace at the time, Wallace and Pinling, I always offered them the greatest respect because I know it wasn't easy to do the jobs that they did. So after qualifying with the Senior Cambridge, the question is, what then? Excuse me. And what I didn't know, I don't think any of us who came from the islands knew, was that the expectation was that we would go back to our family islands as teachers. But nobody bothered to tell us that. Well, by the time I came out of high school at 17 plus 18, I was holding hands with a guy who was going to be my husband, so I wasn't going to Long Island or any other island. And unfortunately, that was taken as an offense by my leaders in the then quote-unquote Board of Education, as it was called, but there was no such thing as a ministry. And so I was assigned to a teaching position at It was called then Eastern Prep 1. Now that's a building just behind the Tribune office between Shirley Street and Dowswell Street. And my principal, Miss Hannah, Olive Hannah, had had 1 year's training in England. I should digress and say that there were several teachers who had been given opportunity to go to college in the United States, but they were men, not women. And later, a few, including some women, were allowed to go for a year in England, remembering always that we're a British colony. So we didn't think much of American education at all in our leadership positions. So when I went to that school, Miss Olive Hannah was the head teacher, as we were called, and she was supposed to be the person training me and one other person as well who was there. Miss Hannah was not a trainer. She was a teacher, but not a trainer, and I think there's a significant difference. And then at about 6 months, 8 months into my first appointment, along came a couple from England called the Prendergasts. Mr. and Mrs. Prendergast. Mr. Prendergast was the inspector of schools. His job was to go to various family islands to make sure schools were still being kept and what they were doing. His wife was called a peripatetic trainer, which meant that she went from school to help students like me to get to be better teachers. That went on for about a year or perhaps a year and a half. And I think they probably were able to persuade the leadership at the time that it might be better to have all of these young people in one place to help them. And that began the Teachers College. The Teachers College was started in the buildings that are now used by C.C. Sweeting High School. They were former Army barracks that were constructed there during World War II. So one was used as the training center itself, that is the meeting rooms. Another was used as a physical education center. Another was used as a library. And three others were used. One was called an infant school. That would be like a prep school or primary school as we call it today. Another was used as junior high, and another was used as a senior high. So as a trainee, I was the head of the prep school, as we called it. Now, the people in my group at the college would have included my good friend Susan Wallace, Eula Delancey, that would be Elise Delancey's mom, Sylvia Coakley, she was from just off East Street, I think it is. So there were people who became very close friends as well as trained teachers. And so once we were trained, so to speak, we were assigned to work in the schools permanently. I stayed at Oaksfield Prep School for a while. And then Mrs. Prendergast decided that she would do something else. She would have us do broadcasts for the Family Island schools. And so we would prepare our lessons. ZNS came and set up for us to do the transmission. And she would stand somewhere to point to us if we were doing something amiss, or shake her head, or whatever she would do to confirm that we were on the right track. And so we did teaching lessons by air while we were still in the training process, as well as, of course, afterwards. Some other names might be known from there would be one called Mr. Lim. He went into banking afterwards. Another one was Mr. Joaquin, who became a permanent secretary, and other people of that ilk. And so at the end of our training, my first outside assignment was at Western Senior School. Now, Theoretically, I was trained to be a teacher of young children, but I got assigned to the high school, quote unquote, in the Bahamas. Ted Glover, for whom the school near the Nassau Guardian is named, T.G. Glover, he was known to be a very, very strict person. And he had no office. So his desk was situated in the room that was my classroom. And in my class was his son. So anybody can imagine the situation that I was placed in. The headmaster's desk was there where he sat. His son was sitting in my class as a student, and I'm a new teacher. But I think he was kind, very kind to me, because he remembered my dad. And sometimes he would chuckle and say, "Oh, girl, you're doing all right," things like that. But I did get in a bit of trouble in the sense that I did something I suppose I shouldn't have. There used to be a thing called the line. I don't know if that still obtains. But if a student misbehaved in a class, the teacher would send him or her to the line. And the line was in my room, because that's where the headmaster's desk was. And the first person came in would stand near the door, then the next one would go behind and behind. And pretty soon the whole room would be surrounded by people who were sent to the line. So one day Mr. Glover was out, and I decided that I would send them all back to their classes. Well, one would have thought that I had set the place on fire. I remember Mrs. Glover, who taught there, Mrs. MacDonald, Maggie MacDonald, a lot of people know her name, and a couple of others. They couldn't believe it. "You are going to get in so much trouble. How could you do such a thing?" So as soon as I saw Mr. Glover's car come in, I met him at the door, and I told him what I'd done. And I said, I sent them all back to their rooms and so forth. He said, "Good. They shouldn't be standing up in there waiting anyhow." And that was the end of the line in my classroom. So I think from an early stage, I started doing little odd things that perhaps were not generally accepted. But overall, I suspect that it did have some effect on how classes and schools were conducted. At Western Senior, I suppose that I might have been there a year or two, I'm not quite sure now. The headmistress at the school where I first taught, Eastern Prep 1, died suddenly. You might have heard the name Carlton Francis. Carlton Francis and his wife were both teachers, and they had studied in the UK, I think in Scotland, because he was a mathematics specialist, and she was a primary school teacher. So when they came back, she was put in charge of that school. But then she was ill, and as I said, she died suddenly. And so I was sent there as the head of that school. Now, remember, this is a school I started out when I was an 18-year-old. And the only memory I had of that at that time was of being opposite a big sapodilla tree. I didn't remember it at all. And so I thought, well, again, I would introduce myself, and had my first PTA meeting. And loads of people came out. And everybody was very happy to see me and so on, except for one lady who happened to have been a teacher. And she said, "Yes, but you're too young to be a principal." I was now 20-odd years old. So that was the only fly in the ointment. But aside from that, I settled in, and I think we did well. Subsequent to that, I went as the head at what was then Wolf Road Primary. This is where the air-conditioned school is now, on Wolf Road. That was since my time. That was after I left that school. But that particular school was also interesting because it was built to be a technical school in the old days. A gentleman called H.O. Nash, who has a school name for him too, was trained to be in charge of a technical school. And that building was constructed to facilitate that work when he came home. But for some reason, the government at the time didn't see that as being important. And so they changed it and altogether changed the curriculum so that he just went into an ordinary, what I would call an ordinary school, and the technical area that was supposed to have been followed was abandoned. Well, I hear we're talking about it nowadays, and I'm so glad to hear that. Right, from Eastern Prep 1, I was transferred to Stephen Dillett. It was usual that if you were absent for a while, you'd go to a different school anyway, and I had my second child at that point. So at Stephen Dillett, which is now Stephen Dillett, it was then called Wolf Road Primary, I went to what was a panel fab school. Now, panel fab is interesting because that too started some problems in New Providence. The government needed to build some schools very quickly and elected to get a company that just built things that had a plastic sort of infilling between two pieces of film. And the people who worked in construction were so angry that they used to just use a knife or a cutlass or a hatchet and would just chop holes in them. So sometimes you'd go to the building and find a big gaping hole in the side, and water would be wetting the paper product that was in between and so on. So when I went out to what was then Lincoln Park, it was really in an area where people were not happy to have that kind of school for good reason, and also where people were not happy to have had what was called Lincoln Park. That was their park, to have a school built on it. So my early days there were mostly taken up with making friends with the families in the area. And fortunately, the government agreed that we could have a cleaning person to clean the school. I should back up and tell you that in the early days, the teachers and the students cleaned the schools after. There was no such thing as cleaning women or cleaning men in those days, besides us. And so the two people who were selected to help to keep the school clean and keep the grounds were from the area, and I think that made a difference to the reception that we eventually got. At the same time, what was being constructed as a panel fab was one on Nassau Street. There was another one, I think, somewhere further up in the area that is now where the shopping center is, in going towards Fox Hill. There were schools that were being built all over, and I suppose the government just didn't have the money to invest in solidly constructed buildings. So they were there for a while, but eventually we did get around to having proper buildings. Now, after I had been at Lincoln Park for a while, I felt that we were losing teachers because of the lack of cooperation that we were having between the educational leadership and the people in the schools who did the work. And so I confess to being very active in out-of-school activities for a while. At the time, people thought they were political, but they were not. It was an effort to try to ensure that teachers receive the respect that they should have always received, that their salaries would at least been semi-commensurate with the work they were doing, and that when there was need for extra work, they would not be considered just vassals and required to do the work rather than being considered as specialists and professionals. So there was a time when my house became the center of activity for preparatory work for several things that perhaps you'd best read about if you read my book rather than me discussing them here. But as far as the children were concerned, I have never worked with teachers who were not considerate of and concerned for the welfare of their students. And I think throughout my terms at different schools, our development, our training went on, our teachers continued to grow. We were able to establish at one point an evening institute, which I think went on for many years, to help teachers who may not have had their full Cambridge certificate to study for and get O levels so that they could get into the Teachers College. And I do remember Mr. Carl Francis in particular, who was, to me, the educator of the century in the Bahamas, who gave his evenings, gave his books, gave his teaching instruction, gave his encouragement, and stood the line when we had to stand the line to do educational work. And so when I heard that they were naming a school in his honor, I was delighted. It took a long time, but it did get done eventually. Now, on to a later stage, I was invited to be an education officer when that position became available. And at first I was not inclined to it because it was leaving the classroom. But then I realized that I did have the opportunity to do some things that I might not have been able to do in the classroom or as a principal. And so began the days of visiting schools regularly, working with the principal and also with the teachers in the schools. And so as an education officer, I worked with people like Sadie Curtis, Reverend Charlie Sanders, who just passed away, and others of that ilk. Telsina Coakley, Susan Wallace was there as well. People like Hugh Sands was the permanent secretary. And we worked consistently and considerably to get the schools to where we thought they ought to be, including visiting Family Island schools. During that period, the Teachers College at San Salvador was established. That was under Cecil Wallace Whitfield as the minister at the time. We had to go down there to work and also to supervise. I have some photographs that show me in an evening gown giving out certificates down in San Salvador. Interesting. But that college was disbanded, of course, as we began to grow some more. But there are quite a number of principals and other teachers still in the islands who were trained there, and they were able to train in I think, an even better way because they lived on campus, interacted with one another and with the instructors. And as minister, Cecil Wallace Whitfield always used to say, don't let them come to Nassau. If they come here, they'll see the bright lights and they don't want to go back to the island. He said, so he would arrange for flights to pick them up in the Family Islands, take them to San Salvador, and then drop them off at the islands when holidays came. Didn't always work. People still came to Nassau, but that was his idea, and I think it was a very worthwhile one at the time. Again, that was a U.S. base that was given over to the government, and the facilities were very, very useful for us at that time. Now, later on, developing through the education system in the office, or before that, I'm not quite sure the sequence now, but I did eventually decide that besides the Teachers College certificate, I want to do more than that. And so I went to the University of Miami for 2 years and got a bachelor's degree. That was quite a decision because I had 2 small children and a husband. But fortunately, our family is very close. And so my sister lived in the house with my family while I was gone and took good care of them. And my children loved it because they flew over to Miami every so often. And then I came home every so often as well, listening always in the airport, Pan American departs from Nassau, Bahamas. And then I was back in another couple of days. Then subsequently, under Sir Lyndon Pinley, it was agreed that there would be a developmental program for administrators. At that time, administrators included permanent secretaries, deputy permanent secretaries, and senior assistant secretaries. And I was selected to be one of those people who would do that program. It was one long weekend in Fort Lauderdale at the university Nova, and the rest of the time was on your own. And we had to do preparatory work to send in every Friday. So that means if you didn't go to sleep on Wednesday and Thursday, by Friday you sent a paper and then fell out for the weekend. But that was the way I did my master's and doctorate degrees, and those are in public administration. People say a doctor is only one when he has a medical degree or when he has a philosophy degree. But it doesn't matter, because at that point, to me, it is really an advantage that one does for oneself, not that you use that much more of what you've learned. So I would advise people, if they're going to proceed to doctorate degrees, to do something that is relevant to what they're working at, rather than just doing it for the sake of having a PhD or whatever they have behind their names. Then I decided, after having done the qualifications, that I would perhaps seek to become the director of education. That I think some of you heard me making a joke of it when the building was named the other day, that the only thing I wanted to be was director. And I applied for it, but I didn't get it. And that's the one job that I did not hold in the Ministry of Education. So obviously there's still room there for somebody like me who should try for it. And as the present director said, that he was watching his back, but he knows better than that. Now, later than that, I went to work, or as a result of that, I should say. I was very disappointed when I was not selected, because I think of the people who were being considered, I was probably as well qualified and perhaps experienced, but it was the day of the men. Men had to be in charge of everything. And so a man was selected, and he was my good friend. He's a lovely, lovely young man. And I was happy that he was able to do the job that he did. But we knew, Susan and I, who had applied, that the selection was made before the interviews were held. And that was very troubling. I trust that in these days and times, when people are more knowledgeable and more able to gain information of all sorts, that nobody tries that kind of nonsense on anyone applying. An applicant needs to be treated completely respectfully and either earn it or not earn it, but not to be excluded on the basis of sex or relationships or any such thing. But that was my experience, and I didn't like it at all. And so I asked to be transferred. And I was transferred eventually as a deputy permanent secretary to the Ministry of Works, which was an equivalent position to the deputy director of education. And I stayed there for a few years. I was happy I stayed. I got a lot of experience there in a lot of ways. And then I got a job as a training officer at a bank, at a trust company, where I worked for 13 years and moved through the ranks there, that I became the manager in charge of the human resources area. And then I also did work on their legal matters, so that when I was leaving, the director sent me a note and he said, well, you'll go now and study law, which is what I might have done, except I got caught up in some other things. Now, the last one has to do with how I got to be Minister of Education. And that was strictly by chance. I had been involved in action of one sort or another for a long time. And I had had two approaches by people from the government side to become a senator. I had said no, because I did not want to involve my company in any outright, overt political activity. And so I had not responded positively up to that point. And then in 1991, I suppose it was, no, it would have been 1990, because I had intended to retire on my 60th birthday. The then leader of the opposition, Hubert Ingram, sent for me. I had never met him before, and he asked if I would come and see him, which I did. I'd heard about him. And I went to his office, and he wanted me to run for Long Island. I said no, I wasn't interested in that at all. But if you were interested in me helping with management and administration in the office, I would do that. So I informed my office, And my then boss, who was a Canadian, said, look, in Canada we let people off duty to run for elections and to participate in political activities. If they're not selected, well, then they come back to their jobs. But if they are, they go on. He said, no, there's nothing wrong with that. He gave me full leave. So in the last months of my work there, I was able to go to work early, leave early, go to my administrative responsibilities in the headquarters, and I did what I thought I could do to eventually end up with the election victory for the FNM in 1992. I had told Mr. Ingram, and he repeated, that when this was over, I was finished. I said, I will repair to I had a big leather couch out front. I said, I'll repair to my leather couch and I'll read. I had said that once before. After I had completed my bachelor's degree and I came home, I told my husband the only thing I'm going to read from here on is true story and modern romances. Well, it didn't take long before I was back in the studying mode. But that time I had said to Mr. Ingram, I'm not going to do anything further. I really meant it. Well, 2 days later, or 3 days later, after the Hurricane Andrew, he came and sat right here and he told me all these things he had in mind and whatnot. And then he said, well, now thank you for helping us, and so on, and off he went. The Sunday after the hurricane, I got a call saying that Mr. Ingram wanted to see me at the cabinet office. My daughter took me down there. I was waiting, Janet Boswick was waiting, and I couldn't figure out what he wanted me for, except maybe to write some notes or something. And then he took me in a room and told me that I was going to be the Minister of Health. Well, I didn't know what a Minister of Health did and what a Minister of Health didn't do, but one thing I had learned, and I remember the story clearly as if I'm seeing the gentleman now. He was the French ambassador at the time, very blue eyes and a very thin mouth. We were at Government House for some reason, and I had said to him in discussion, when this election is over, I'm out, I'm finished, I'm done. And he said, if your leader asks you to do something and it is not illegal and it is within your capacity, you do it. And when I first started stuttering and saying, no, I didn't, I remembered his face and I said yes. And thereafter, as you know, I spent 2.5 years at Health, then I did the rest of my service at Education and retired as the Minister of Education. On leaving the Ministry of Education, PM said, I have one more thing I want you to do, Ms. Dumont. He said, I want you to be the chairman of the Public Service Commission. And I said, all right. While I was at the Public Service Commission, I was only there for 10 months. He called again and said, I'd like you to substitute for Sir Orville while he's on vacation. I didn't know that Sir Orville was demitting office, and I went to act in Sir Orville's stead and ended up becoming the Governor General for a period of 4 years. But that time, I had really prayed about it, and I knew that it was 4 years, and I told him at the time that I would do it for 4 years, which I did. And I retired, finally, after the 4 years. Well, boys and girls, I understand that young people are going to be listening to what I had to say. And I expect that some of you would be thinking, now, how can I achieve what I want to? First of all, you have to decide that you're very special. Secondly, you have to decide that you have the ability. And thirdly, you have to decide that you will need help along the way. First, my dad always said to us, straighten your shoulders. You're just as good as anybody, but you're not worse than anybody. Secondly, the ability. I mentioned that I didn't do well in the garden. You remember I said I took the plants up to see if the roots grew that night? Well, we used to have a garden at home too, and my sisters and brothers banned me from it for obvious reasons. And now you would understand why I'm not a gardener. That was not my bent at all. And if anyone had pushed me to be a gardener, I probably would have failed. But I loved to read. And as a child, my grandmother would send us books from Nassau, and we would read. Nobody in my house learned to read after they went to school. Everybody read before we went to school. So we learned as we went along. And we had the ability, and we knew it, and we kept going. And thirdly, help is always available. All you have to do is to ask for it. When Mr. Francis, that I mentioned earlier, was teaching us in the evenings at Evening Institute, he also helped us by letting us come to his house. We could sit in his garage, use his books. He'd help us with answering questions. He was one of the people that I always admired for helpfulness. And I think that is true of good teachers generally. They're willing to help. And when I say good teachers, I'm not talking about necessarily trained teachers. Your parents, your relatives, older people. Sometimes I regret that I didn't listen to my grandmother more than I did do, because now I talk about her a lot. She used to say, I know it's going to rain. And we'd say, well, how could she know it's going to rain? But she knew, because she had had major surgery, and when it was going to rain, her arm would swell. So we learn a lot, but as children we sometimes would laugh at it. We'd go around the corner and think, oh, how does she know anything about raining? But she did. So listen to your grandparents, listen to your aunts and uncles, listen to the stories they tell, because while all might not be useful, some will be. Now, as far as the teachers are concerned, teaching does not mean that we've stopped learning. As a matter of fact, a good teacher is always seeking something else to learn. Not necessarily in the field of pedagogy, but rather in the field of life. And one of the suggestions that I've been making to young and old people these days is not only to read, but also to write. Recently, I've seen some programs on the local television station where authors are being allowed to tell about how they accomplish their writings, talk about their books and so forth, which is great. Because in the early days we had maybe 1 or 2 books, but not now. We're having a lot of them. Some are not literature as such, but they're well-written stories about families. Everybody has a story. Now, I told you a few of my stories this morning, but there are many, many more stories that if we sat together, I would be able to tell you. Some of them that might be useful, some that would just be funny, and some would be of no value at all. But I think it's time that we wrote. Now, how are you going to do that? A very well-known author told me once, write every day. Take a big legal pad or any piece of paper you have, and in the morning decide, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write about what happened to me yesterday. All the things I saw, all the things I smelled, all the people I talked to, write it down. And soon you'll find that you have a whole body of work. And when the time comes for you to write your book, you're not going to have to go asking people anything, because you're going to have it all written down. What he said to me was, write every day. Some days you will have a good story. Some days it wouldn't be very good. The next morning you read what you've written. And depending on how good it is, you keep it. If it's not, put an X through it, but keep it anyway. Because who knows, one of these days it might be useful for you. So those are my recommendations to students and to teachers, but to teachers in particular, because I know sometimes we're so tired when we get home at night, we don't even feel like looking at something that could write, like a pen or a pencil, but do it. And keep your logs. If you can find some good big writing books, start writing in a book. I have several of them. My daughter has taken them because she thinks that she owns my material. But you know what? You can do it too. You can do it. And lastly, let me encourage you to read my book. The stories I told you, to some not all of them, so some of them are in there. Read it. It's not heavy literature at all. It's just plain, homegrown storytelling.